find yourself in the middle of a desert valley. There's something about the smell and the taste of that place that makes you think of the soundtrack of yo 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 yo. And there's something inside of you that almost expects a bush of tumbleweed to roll across the scene from the background. And then you realize that that's not going to happen, because the way that your skin feels dry and the way that you feel your tongue sticking to the roof of your mouth, this air is not pushing any tumbleweed anywhere. This air stands still. You can see those half dust forms of straws just standing there, dead grass, almost like set in resin, immovable, stuck in this heat, this thick, silent air. You adjust your foot slightly when you hear this weird sound of click. And as you look towards your toes, you realize what you are standing on. It's bones. Bones. You're standing on the remains of bodies. Skulls and bones of different shapes and sizes piled on top of each other, layer upon layer. This is a place of death. That's what you bumped your toe into as you adjusted your feet. And as you hear the echo of that initial click fade between those mountains, silence. You stand there. You take in the scene. And you listen. You listen to death. You breathe death. Dry, hot, crisp. The air shimmering, creating mirrors above the shadow, the valley of the shadow of death. You feel for them and you fear for yourself. You feel for them and you fear for yourself, because suddenly you realize that you are not just standing on matter, you are standing on the remains of bodies that used to be like you. It gets claustrophobic in your chest. It is a broad valley, but there is so little air to breathe. You hyperventilate. It's ringing in your ears. Ben Adam. You, son of man. You've been addressed like this before. In fact, the voice that is now addressing you and talking to you often uses that phrase, Ben Adam. But in this context, it somehow feels graver and heavier. This is the one thing that links you to those bones. Mortal, it says, according to some translations, mortal, can these bones live? Can these bones live? You are torn between two emotions at the same time, because there's a part of you that knows they can't. There's a part of you that still remembers that click of that dry sound of that bone echoing from the walls of the valley, and you know that this is an impossibility. And yet you cannot bring those words across your lips, because you also know that that reality then becomes yours. Mortal, can those bones live? Is what that voice asks of you. You wish you could say they can. You wish, but you do not dare to, because you know that this is an impossibility. So all you do is you say, "Oh Lord God, you know." And in that tiny little delegation of sense making and meaning making, of mapping of possibilities. What you've just done is you've tangled and tied into a knot, a tiny little package, all of your frustrations, all of your despair, and all of your hopes at the same time. Can these bones live? Oh Lord, only you know. Then he said to me, prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says Lord God to the bones, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. I will lay sinews on you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And hearing those words right after, mortal, gives you hope. This valley now becomes something else. It becomes a valley of death with potential, a valley of hopelessness with a tinge of hope. Prophesy to these bones, the voice had said. So you open your mouth and you prophesy as you have been commanded. And as you speak, and the words that have been given to you are rolling over your mouth and your lips, and you hear your voice saying the same things that you just heard that gave you the permission to hope, you hear click. The words continue flowing, but you turn your face towards the sound that you just heard. Click, click, click. That clacking sounds a little bit like those wind chimes made of bamboo that you can find in exotic esoteric shops. What is that? Click, 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 click. Ooh, that thigh bone over there just moved. And another one over there, and another one over there. And you see, as there's more and more of the bones moving, they keep rolling themselves, twirling and shifting themselves as if they had a way, as if they had a purpose, as if they had somewhere to go, somewhere to be, almost desperately finding their way towards the place that they are compelled to take. And that clacking gets louder and louder until chaotic hustle and bustle takes over the entire valley. But wait, look, those two over there, they've just clicked together. And over there as well. And those bones keep on rolling together and bundling up and finding places on top of each other, next to each other, side by side each other. They roll and they roll and they roll up the bits that have already clicked together to find the place that used to belong to them. So soon enough, as you finish the message that was granted to you, you are looking at a valley of skeletons. Click, 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 frrr, click. The last one finds its spot. Well, frankly, you're not entirely sure if this scene is now any better than the disorganized piles of human remains that you originally witnessed. But you do not have much time to deliberate, because you hear a different sound. Weird, wet, like stepping on a slug. And you see ligaments, veins and muscles, like a slowly crawling wave covering each skeleton. Skin growing to cover the redness of the raw flesh. Bodies, human forms, lined up all around you, silent, immovable, familiar but strange. They're obviously here, but entirely absent. They're looking, but not seeing. Uncanny. Uncanny is what these bodies now are. Mortal, can these bones live? O Lord God, you know. Prophesy. Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, mortal, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, O ruach, O wind, and breathe upon these slain that they may live. And I prophesied as he commanded me. And the breath came into them, an electrical charge surging through their nervous systems, a symphony of gasps for the first breath of air, colors exploding around the pupils that you could now see. And these bodies lived. These bones lived. A vast multitude, alive and on the move. Mortal, can these bones live? O Lord God, you know. Thus says the Lord God, I am going to open your graves. I am going to open your grave, your dry bones, if this is what you are feeling like you are currently experiencing in your spiritual journeys, and bring you up from your graves, O my people, and I will bring you back to the land that belongs to you. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I open your graves, when I bring you up from your graves, O my people. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live. And I will place on you and I will place you on your own soil, your own territory, the things that belong to you. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and will act, says the Lord. And as you now look at that valley, you feel something entirely different. It's a place of death that was a promise of your future that has now been turned into a promise of life, of prosperity, of spirit, of wind, of breath, of freshness, of the reality of God's changing power in your life, however dry it may feel. And as you stand there, awash with entirely different feelings, you realize the beauty of what had just happened. You had witnessed God at work, and you had witnessed God demonstrating to you in the most marvelous way what you are called to do, what the only living body in that valley can do with God. That wind did not come by itself. That wind did not even come when you received the command to go out there and when you received the words from God, the promises from God that this is all what would happen. That wind came as you spoke life, as you were instructed to, onto those bones. It's a wonderful story in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37. And we know that in very many ways, that story was not it just yet. So we are looking at resurrection at two layers. We're looking at Ezekiel going through this, looking at those bones in the valley, experiencing the dryness, experiencing a personal and communal crisis all at the same time, and then being granted the privilege to speak God's words of life onto those bones, so that the difference happens not as God says those words, but the difference happened when Ezekiel spoke. God gave Ezekiel that power to speak life into the bones, and then the Spirit empowered it. So this story comes with two layers. It comes with a promise to all of the dry bones, all of us who are feeling like we are literally in the middle of the desert and our tongues are sticking to the roof of our mouths, and we cannot see how this could be any fresher, any more alive, how this could ever be any more alive. And this also comes as a promise to anyone who stands in that valley, looking over those bones in our churches, in our communities, because we have been invited and empowered to make a difference, to speak life. God gives us the words to speak, and as we speak, His Spirit acts. This is the beginning that I want to start with. It is a mighty promise. And then after all of that vision, Ezekiel had to go and witness that happening in the lives of the people that he cared about, in the community that was his, on the territory that was granted back to him. And he was supposed to guide all of that and then speak those words again and watch that promise come to life around him in his community. That is what we are called to do as well. But the topic that I'm currently talking about, that I have chosen as the main theme, is one of those things that is almost like a hook in our hearts, like a hook, like a claw in our system that is stopping us from speaking life into those dry spaces around us, which is ultimately what we are called to do. So I hope that as we go through the next ideas together, that you will follow with me, and it would not be projected out there, but it would be entirely an internal journey of figuring out how stretching out that knot in our souls can help us actually release some of those threads that have been tangled and have been stopping us from feeling like moving freely in collaboration with the Spirit of God. Here we go. I want to start by asking you genuinely this question. I have found this a deeply spiritual question. What bothers you? Like, I think that we could start and we could take a couple of maybe weeks even. What bothers you? You can think in your head about all these moments, about all these people. I see some of the comments there, like injustice. There are plenty of things that are supposed to bother us, but I think that some of those answers, at least in my heart, to that question sound more or less like this. Those people. Now, those people is this wonderful thing, because I could add those people over there, because it's literally the definition of what a culture or a community that has a separate identity usually does. It's like us over here and them over there. This is how we do things, and this is how they do things over there. And ultimately, this is the other. It is somebody that I have put out there, kept them at an arm's distance, or rather even further. I want to look at the anatomy of how this other is originally born. And I want to start from the very beginning so that we could trace if there are elements that we need to do and elements where we need to start applying additional filters and alarm systems. It is crucial to understand that every human being is built to notice the different, to detect and organize patterns, to operate with incomplete information. Now, this is the basic needs that we need to operate in this world. We're supposed to be able to walk down the path, let's say, walk down the path that we know so well, that we could walk from our kitchen to our bathroom with our eyes closed. And yet, when we don't have our eyes closed, then we are trained, our brains are trained to notice the things that are different, so that we don't stumble over the most recent thing that the children have piled on our path. We are supposed to be able to take these wonderful tests where you're given a set of like a cognitive skill test, where you're given a set of different images, and you're supposed to notice the one that is different, the one that doesn't fit the kind of the line, the row. We are supposed to do that quickly, and actually our ability to function in this society and in this world is measured by whether we are able to do that or not. At the kindergarten level, when children don't manage to do that, then we call in special educators so that they would be able to teach those children how to create that type of mental procedures that would enable us to do that faster. We're supposed to detect and organize patterns. If you remember from maths classes, you were often, again, given like a circle, a triangle, a triangle, a circle, a triangle, a triangle, a circle, and you were supposed to continue with triangle, a triangle. again, another cognitive skill that is considered essential for human functioning. We're supposed to be able to walk into a grocery store and understand the concept of aisles, patterns, right? Understand the structures, how to navigate those patterns. And all of that actually helps us operate with incomplete information. So we are supposed to be able to look at a situation that is entirely new to us and import previous experiences, previous mental conclusions into that situation so that we could function. If that part of our psychology and our neurology doesn't work, then we are doomed. We will struggle. So it's wonderful. It's God created, marvelous human functioning. What happens next, however, moves to a more social layer. We are now moving away from what our brain is wired to do, and we are now moving to social categories and how we then build narratives around those elements. As a result of detecting the differences, as a result of organizing patterns, as a result of trying to fill in the gaps in our knowledge that we naturally have, because we couldn't possibly know everything, we also create categories. And those categories are not just random labels, but those categories come with meaning assigned to them, which means that if I now name a category, it is not just a label, but it actually comes with a bubble of a defined boundary. A category has to be boundary to be useful. If everything blurs into everything else, it doesn't help us much. So a cat has to be a cat. A chair has to be a chair. And we know how confused we get when stuff gets on the boundary of those things. Like, is a bottle that I am sitting on a chair, or is it a bottle? What defines a chair? The moment we walk into categories, things get more complicated. And yet it is something that we so naturally do. And it is something that we hardly ever think about as we operate on a daily basis in this world. So we create categories and we assign meaning to those categories. What happens next is quite uniquely a human trait of operation. Those categories, with their meanings, are then oftentimes linked to identity. Not always. The category of cat might have absolutely zero to do with my identity, but I could also map myself as a cat lover or a dog lover. There are much more obscure and general categories there that start marking the way that we identify ourselves. I realize that I, as a human being, belong to some of those categories. I provide significance for those categories. There are bits that don't matter and bits that matter, and we inherit a lot of that, and we fight some of that, but most of those categories we are perfectly fine with. I am a human being in the category of creatures with a nose. It doesn't come with massive social meaning. It doesn't form a significant part of my identity. But I also am a woman in my 40s with experience of mainly the European context, some parts, significant parts of my life in Eastern European context. I'm an Adventist, I am a Christian, I am an academic, I am a thinker, I am someone who loves art, etc., etc., etc. So now we are talking about categories that have meaning that is not just general, but it is meaningful to me in my creation of my identity. I'm glad, Patty, that you're on the side of the cats. We can probably start a war here in the Adventist Today chats, and that will have consequences for decades to come with a cat and dog discussion. But you see, this is exactly what happens in the creation of the other. And again, none of that is in any way negative. I'm supposed to understand as I function in the society, which people are my people, who is a part of my family, who are the ones who are responsible for me as a child, and who are the ones that are completely irrelevant and potentially dangerous. It is a normal part of being a human. Identity creation inevitably requires subscription to certain identities, certain categories, and unsubscribing from other categories that other people might find significant. If I do not know who I am nothing. I evaporate into this blur or a blob of things. So we are actually, as adults, expected to know where our boundaries lie, what I am and what I am not. It's a wonderful gift. This is the thing that makes us unique. This is the thing that also gives us uniqueness as God's creation, uniqueness in the functions of being a part of Christ's body, to use very heavy Adventist jargon. Now comes the section where the other is possible. Because as soon as you know that this is where I end, you realize that that's where the other starts. There are many famous others. The national other, the ethnic other, the tribal other or the racial other, the gender or sex-based other, sexual orientation or sexuality-based other, socioeconomic status-based other, religious or faith-based other, cultural or subcultural other, generational other or ideological other, etc., etc., etc. And we know, because so many of those fights we are currently fighting, we are actively undoing some of those boundaries that have caused more trouble than just the question of where I end and another person starts. This is a natural part of being a human, belonging to a space, belonging to a community, belonging to a category. What happens next is where it gets tricky. Because just the concept of the other is not yet in any way discriminatory or abusive. Which is why people writing about and thinking about these categories have come up with this wonderful word called othering. This is what happens next. It doesn't have to, but it oftentimes inevitably does. Othering is the process in which you take that other and you distance yourself from them. You create disconnection, which then permits lack of understanding, lack of experience, and generalizations. The further you step from a group of people, the easier it is to completely lose sight of the diversity in that group. They all become that blob that is the same. They are all the same. And the moment that they have become all the same at a safe distance, you now have the right to project onto them. The things that you don't like, the things that you wonder if they are true, you can easily just assign those meanings onto that group. And you don't need to worry because you have kept them distant enough for none of that to challenge you. The next steps, we know from history and personal experiences potentially, are dehumanization to the point of demonization. Somebody over there onto whom you have had the luxury of projecting things for weeks, for months, for years, for decades, for centuries, is easy to now, in the light of the colors that you have painted on top of their faces, to be considered less of a human, less important, less valuable. And very often, because this is how human nature in the fallen world operates, the things that we project onto them are not just quirky things, but are also mean and evil things. It becomes a part of our communal, within our boundaries, our communal purification. We make ourselves nice and safe. And in that process, we put all of the bad out there on top of those people over there. It is only logical that as that process goes on, then we are looking at those people ultimately as perceived threats. They are ultimately less. They are dangerous. They are all of those things that we don't hold dear. They actively challenge the things that we hold dear. The response to that is fear and anger. And very often, as we look from a distance, it seems also entirely justified. I have every right to fear, and I have every right to be angry. And as those schisms grow, then the practices of abuse keep repeating themselves and repeating themselves. And every time that the other acts according to our projected narratives, we take it as proof. Every time that another hurts us, we generalize it onto that entire group and claim that entire culture, that entire way of thinking, that entire way of looking an abusive, a violent community. We respond in hurt with fear and anger. So you can see how all of that is so natural. How flowing from one step to the next step can so easily occur. And then from one point, it's just snowballing down that slope. And there's almost nothing you can do because everything perpetuates the narrative that you have started from the disconnect. Who are the othered? I would like to move away today. I don't want to exclude any types of othering, but today I would like to challenge us to think about the otherings that are not as familiar, that are not the ones that we are already so used to thinking about. We need to keep on thinking about those, period, all the time, and there's so much to be done. But I also wonder if that process is so natural to us that whilst we are addressing those problems on this side, we are creating new problems on the other side because it just happens. It's just something that just happens as a part of human nature, as a part of human communal functioning. And if we are not intentionally attentive to those processes, then we'll just be repeating the same thing, just shifting the scope of the other onto a new group and another group and another group. So here are the others, the types of others that you can meet. The irksome other. It's the one that constantly irritates you, the one that annoys you. It's the one that we immediately think about when we ask this question, who bothers me? All of those people over there, they're the irksome, the bothering others. Then there's the invisible other, which is an even more dangerous category because we don't think of them. We don't even realize that they're there. We walk past them and we don't register them because something in our social patterns has ordered us to ignore, to just doesn't map. Our radar doesn't pick that category up. Then we have the lesser other, the one that we can always just look down on, the one that needs our help, the one that we can either look at and go like, oh, it's a good thing that I am not like that. Or we can go, oh, you poor thing, isn't it wonderful that I'm here to help you? What happens there is that I still consider that other less valuable and less worthy. They serve my picture and my narrative as somebody that elevates who I am and permits me to be benevolent. There's the enviable other. There's somebody that is living the life that we think we should be living. And it is oh so sweet to project things onto them so that we would know that this is unjust. And the fact that they are living that life must be because they are doing something wrong. It couldn't possibly be just the fact that the cards were dealt this way. Then there's the exotic other. There's the one that we use for entertainment. The one who is far enough from us to not scratch and scrape against our norms and our traditions. They don't bother us, but they're so pretty to look at. They're just there to entertain. They are there to be consumed by us. The ones that need to stick as they are so that I could enjoy the view. The exotic other for consumption. And there are all these other others that we create on a daily basis. On a daily basis. Disconnection to generalizations, to projections, to dehumanization, to demonization, especially in spiritual communities. That then all feeds into a perceived threat that then requires the response of fear and anger. Who others? This is a grammar section, basically. I other, you other, he, she, it, others. I other. There's a personal layer to othering that we are all guilty as charged of. We do that, and we know the moments when we do that. We here, other. We create small groups such as this, and we feel good about coming together because we see eye to eye, because we know that we have this feeling of the elbow of the other person next to us, because we share labels and categories, because we can look at each other and just give each other a wink, and we already know what the other one is going to say. And the ones out there, they don't really get us. They don't really know how to fix the world, which we all can come together here, even on a weekly basis, to do as we sit, see eye to eye, and nudge each other's elbows. Everybody, others. It's a practice that we are terribly fond of as society. We do that perpetually. Just look at the news. Just look at the social media commentary sections. And the establishment, others. All of those things that are given to us, all of those structures, all of those things that Foucault was very fond of talking about, the institutions, the religious, military, educational, political, they come with a well-established and well-oiled systems of othering that we just are taught to fit into, taught to walk and talk along the lines of. In all these layers, we can probably talk about those two bits. There is always a layer of active agency. There is something that I choose to do. There are moments when I know that I have chosen to discard a person or dismiss a group. You could call these the parts of active agency in othering. And then we have those inherited narratives that we are almost like not even directly involved in creating. It's just something that is a story that is passed down from generation to generation, from system to system. It permeates the air that we breathe and the drinking water that we run from the tap. And it's just how things are. It's common knowledge. The sun rises from the east and, well, from the Estonian context, Russians are evil. They're the same level of facts. I mean, if anyone wants to know more about the historical context, why that is the case, then you can. Then I'll just say Cold War and the Soviet Union and the Iron Curtain, and you can imagine how that narrative got handed down and how that narrative is not doing particularly well, being demolished these days with the political situation. And I'm an Estonian, so I can say that I can talk about this. So there we go. We are looking at disconnection that leads to generalization, projection, dehumanization, demonization, that then leads to perceived threat, that then leads to fear and anger, which seem entirely justified, that then leads to action. And then we can look at, what do we do with this? What happens next? Once I have determined that we over here know and do right, and them over there don't know and do wrong. That is the key part now. But it doesn't often seem like a key part, because if you've gone down that slide already so far, then the next steps too seem natural. We are looking at 3 approaches. You can look at segregation or secession, a way of separating things, keeping them separate, making sure that you build walls in between and you establish those solid boundaries so that nothing gets across, so that you can live happily in those distinctly separate spaces and always think about the other on that side, always project at that other on that side, but you diminish that contact to almost zero. You just split. You split up. The alternative to this is what we like to think sometimes as a solution: assimilation. It is bringing everyone together and making sure that we all look the same, that we erase any categories, that we don't permit people to look different, act different, think different. We just create this weird porridge that they ate in Matrix, you know, that blurb, that is tasteless, that is colorless, that is just one solid mush. Mortal, can these bones live? The truth is that once I have slid down that slope, once I have taken that slide, and that voice asks me, mortal, can these bones live? My answer is an honest, I don't care. It's easy to do that to an other. Lauren is asking about my Matrix reference. I was just trying to find like this bland, weird goo. And I think that's what they ate in the original films. Like this. It's just bland goo. But I think that once you look at this slide over here, then you realize how unacceptable that slide should be to us. Because mortal, can these bones live should never be replied to with I don't care. And yet, so often, in so many of our internal narratives, in so many of our communal narratives, we find this to be actually true when we look into the mirror. That's what I would invite us to do today. Take a look into the mirror and ask yourself, at all those layers of possible othering groups, individually or in small groups or as a society or as a member or a cog in this big establishment, to which degree do I other? And as we are here as people who came to listen to an Adventist Today Sabbath seminar, then does Adventism other? And I think, Lauren, in that sense, it goes truly down that path of the next publishing that you're working on, because our key identity markers have always, not always, have often been swaying on the side of exclusivist narratives. Our key metaphors of who we are and how we come together, the categories that we have chosen to assign the greatest meaning to in our creation of our identity and our narrative, have often been exclusivist narratives and have often been narratives that other with great gusto. Lauren, you wanted to add something there?
No, I'm just preparing for the question period that's coming up.
Okay. Good. And yet we are looking at that moment where God is asking, mortal, can these bones live? And the key question in this, in identifying those parts in our lives, in actually counteracting those parts, and in making sure that we are aware enough to have systems of alarms set up so that we don't keep repeating that pattern as a group, as a church, as a society, as people within the Adventist communities, as people around the Adventist communities, is, can I stop that process so that I would be able to live? So that I would be able to be a body that is free to breathe instead of being tangled in those processes of othering that form tight knots in our souls. And once I know that God's promise is that I can I untangle those knots to the degree that I can be a part of speaking life onto the bones of all these others indiscriminately as the Spirit blows? That is what I personally am struggling with and praying about and building up my hopes about individually and communally. Now I really want to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you for being with me.
And thank you so much. That was definitely engaging, and you really held our attention there, and you made some very, very key points. And I'm already thinking of some of the ways that we've been taught to practice othering. Little things like not reading things that are not published by an Adventist publishing house, or all of these other little things that we get into. But I see Lauren and Bjorn are ready to go with their questions. For the rest of you, if you want to join the conversation, usually the raise hand is somewhere to the bottom right of your screen, depending on the device. You should see that option to raise your hand. So we invite you to raise your hand, join the conversation, and we'll invite you to speak as best as possible in the order that you raise your hand. So Lauren, you definitely were first. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kärt. I was just, I kind of figured you were getting near the end there. And I said, I've got to get in on this because I kind of sense that I have spent most of my life as either othering others or being an other. The whole non-Adventist thing that somebody mentioned here, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago in the class. In fact, but my friend Dan Jett was one who mentioned this to me. He was Methodist and he married Gina, and he said to her one time, I've never known anybody else who has a whole word just to designate people who aren't us, non-Adventists. Somebody corrected that for me one day when I wrote about that or said something about it. They said, yeah, actually Catholics, the same thing. Catholics have non-Catholics, and Mormons do it too. But clearly it has something to do with our identity as being somewhat sectarian. And we keep trying to convince ourselves that this is, well, I don't know if we try to convince ourselves. Maybe we do. Maybe some really believe it. I think some of our leaders truly believe that we are superior to everybody else. Not just in truth, but in every way, we are superior. Here's the question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to, you talked about the danger of that spot where we separate from one another, and I love that. I just love that ladder of ideas: disconnection, generalization, projection, dehumanization, and demonization. I mean, that is brilliant, and we need that for our next magazine. By the way, that is a really good schematic of how it happens, and I really like that. However, let's also talk about the value of tribalism. I have a friend for whom, whenever we talk about the Adventist church, um, I won't tell you who it is because I don't want to embarrass Bjorn Carlman, but uh, he'll talk about how what I really value about my church is that we have each other. And wherever I've lived in the world, I go into a church and I'm an Adventist, and we have each other. And so we've got this great value that's almost like a family thing. And the same is true with me as weird of an Adventist as some people might think I am. I too could walk into any church in the world, and I would know all the language. I would know the rituals. I would know what we were eating that day for food. I would know how to greet everybody with Happy Sabbath. We would all know how to be part of this family, and I kind of like that, Kärt. Mm-hmm. I don't want to really apologize for it. I kind of want to embrace it. And Bjorn has helped me a lot in realizing that as we've talked about that. And I'll just add this, and you can address it, or you can do whatever you want with it, or just ignore it. Here's another kind of othering that I realized. I did not realize until I became a pastor how much the pastor becomes the other in the congregation. You're either regarded as more holy or regarded as more prone to being a hypocrite if they see something they don't like in you. There's lots of ways that you get, and I never, fortunately, I'm a person who doesn't mind kind of being on my own, but I think as a pastor, I think we were a bit lonely. Even surrounded by people who said they adored us, we were lonely because nobody can live up to that. You know, nobody is good enough to live up to that. And the few people like Dan and Gina who just kind of took us on kind of face level with all our faults and everything became lifelong friends. But that's another othering. So those are my 2 points. One is the value of being part of a group and how that relates to othering, and the way that you can be in a group and even a leader of a group and very much be the other. Those are 2 things.
I do for that reason want to emphasize precisely that difference between the normalcy of the other, because the categories are supposed to exist, and in some ways there are always going to be the others, and how that does not necessarily have to condition othering, because othering in itself is an abusive practice, and we can choose not to do that. When it comes to them, what you mentioned about a kind of like the space of comfort, which Adventist church oftentimes is, doesn't it also at the same time make you really sad? Because it actually just tells us how much of the other we have erased in our project of spreading the right way of doing and doing things with God and being with God. And I'm just like, I am a woman of habit and of comfort spaces. So for me, from that category, I might as well go to McDonald's. That just tells you something about my dietary patterns. But I might also just as well go to McDonald's and also know what I am getting. Exactly know what I am getting, this side of this planet or the other side of the planet. And it comes with this warm, fuzzy feeling. And you know that if everything around is like weird raw fish, you can still always count on McDonald's to do something that you can relate to and feels comfortable and comforting. And in some ways, we are called to partially to do that, to be a safe haven, to be a sanctuary, to be the place of comfort that carries a person, but yet we're supposed to be so much more. And also, once we do that, it does not need to lead to othering. It does not need to create hierarchical structures. It does not need to elevate anybody above anyone else. And I just wish that we could see the society as a flatter structure, and also look at God operating on a structure that is much less us-centered than we'd like to think. You know, God can provide the same services of comfort and convenience in McDonald's, if this is all I'm looking for, you know. And I wish that we as a community were better at recognizing God at work in structures that seem different from us.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Very good. I mentioned here a few weeks ago, and I think a lot of people related to it, that I have very, very few friends who are in Seventh-day Adventists. Very few. And I would like to, but I have no world in which to go and meet them, really, because I'm totally wrapped up in this. I've been a pastor. I've been an Adventist. I'm a fifth-generation Adventist. I've been in this all my life. And to go outside the border, even though I don't always fit comfortably in here, is hard. Now I'm really looking forward to what Bjorn's going to respond to me, since since
you poked him
a little bit, teased him a little bit.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren. And as you were speaking, another one of the things I'm reminded about in terms of how we do the othering is my friends would always, I would invite them to come to church with me, but I never reciprocated and visited their churches, you know, and that is, you know, another one of those things that feeds into the othering without even realizing, because I didn't notice that I was doing it until someone pointed it out to me. Bjorn, please join the conversation.
Wow, this has been a great presentation and conversation so far. And I've been shifting my question all over the place, but I've always felt othered because I'm a third culture kid. I'm a missionary kid. I'm technically Swedish on paper, but lately even the Swedish embassy's been giving me problems about proving that I'm Swedish. Anyway. So I always feel a little bit on the periphery, and one of the scariest experiences of my life was, I remember just as Obama was getting elected, and I was fully Obama. I was living in Hollywood, and I had to take a job in Northern California in McCain Palin country at the time. The signs were still up, and it was hard for me because I was quite recently out of college, and I saw myself as a total Democrat, albeit a Swedish one. And so I moved up to Paradise, California, and to work up at Feather River Hospital. And I remember I just felt so alone because the entire political climate, I mean, you talk about America being polarized right now. It felt very polarized then. And I felt like a fish out of water up, and it was just like rural. I was gone from Hollywood to just living in the sticks. And I had to make friends with people that were completely different from me, or I would be absolutely isolated. So I started making friends with people that, one of my friends would be like, "Hey, the Swedish socialist is here," and stuff like that. And I would just, I just have to accept it. So I started making friends with people that were politically different. And then I started, Lauren's thing about making friends with people that are not Adventists. I tried to find more friends that weren't Adventists than friends that were in the community. And, I don't know how much I shifted. I'm probably still fairly progressive and fairly, I don't know that it really shifted me, but it was so good for me in that I began to see the other side as human. I was able to connect with them, and it was somehow less scary. I think we as Adventists have a really hard time because we're scared of stepping out of that safety bubble. So I'm wondering, Kärt, are there ways that we can challenge ourselves as Adventists? I don't think this othering thing has to be quite as severe, but a lot of it's fear driven because we're so ensconced in our bubbles. How can we challenge ourselves a little bit to step out there and realize that maybe other people aren't that bad. Maybe it's not that scary. Maybe the othering thing is very much in our heads.
Well, I think I've said that before, but one of the muscles that I am the most concerned about in our culture, in our Adventist culture, is the muscle of discernment of the spirit. We just don't deal with that. We kind of get the spirit vicariously, secondhand, third hand, through the fundamental belief. Somebody somewhere out there has studied, somebody somewhere out there has been inspired, and then it is passed down to us, and it is our job to make sense of it, and then to sign that declaration, basically. And then we know that we are safe, right? Then we know that we are doing the right thing, and we don't have anything to worry about when we walk the walk with God, because we know we are walking the walk of God, right? Because it's there in black and white. And I think that's ultimately what we have lost in that process, is the idea of us also individually and communally engaging with discernment of the spirit. And if we were better trained at this, we would not be afraid of stepping out there, because we would recognize the spirit at work wherever it is at work, right? And we would also recognize the spirit not at work wherever it is at work. But currently what has happened is that we have taken a part of the work of the spirit and we have put it down on the paper, and we have claimed that we have mapped and captured the spirit, and thus endeth. And now as we sit in that little circle, right, then we're safe. And when we go out there, we know, well, I don't think, like, what do we think that God will do with us, you know? Because we have created that narrative of that all around us, then possibly we can't even imagine God being out there. Or if God is out there, then he's only doing those freaky special missions for SWAT teams, for which some people are especially prepared. Well, but that's no way to live. That's no way to live a spiritual walk with God, when you've literally bound yourself in a tiny little, like a pen, and you're afraid to go out, because what will God do to you if you get lost, you know? Well, there are many parables about what God will do to you when you get lost, first of all. Secondly, what kind of God is it that we are serving in that tiny little circle? Does this mean that everyone who is within, we also don't know how to discern the spirit within that circle, because we assume that just because you're in that circle, because you've signed those documents, you are now led by the spirit. And we don't even know what to do with those votes when people go into halves, or when people who are supposed to be equipped for SWAT missions end up coming back with documents that are literally like a third, and a third. We just don't know what to do with that stuff, because we've let one part of our muscles, spiritual muscles, entirely get atrophied. And now we are walking like, you know, like with a withered arm or with a withered leg. Can these bones live? Yes, they can, but this needs to be intentional. That's what I feel like. And then you can walk your walk with God within the boundaries of the church and outside the boundaries of the church, wherever he leads.
No.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Baron, for that question, and thanks, Kärt, for your response. Bob, please join the conversation.
Thank you, Karen. I must say, Kärt, this has been a huge learning experience, and it really made me much more conscious of the othering. My question is this: isn't othering the default position for humans? We are born in a particular society. We are born at a particular socioeconomic level. We are born in a particular part of the world. We are born in a particular religion, although even in some religion, there's some election to really exacerbate the othering. But isn't it, I want to think of tribalism, isn't it automatic, isn't it a default that we are born in a state of othering, and it requires our personal and collective election to transcend that? And are there any really benefits of othering? Is there any benign othering? Those are my two questions.
I don't know if there's any benign othering, because we're usually talking about groups. I have to go back a couple of steps there and say that there are definitely moments when violation has happened. There are definitely situations where trauma is real. There are definitely moments when the fear is entirely justified, because there are perpetrators and there are systems that are violent and that are unfair. So all of that is entirely, I'm not trying to say that we should be living our lives naively. And also fear and anger are perfectly justified and spirit inspired, not fear perhaps, but you know, the alarm that goes off in your head and that says danger, danger, you know, that those things are entirely normal parts of functioning in our world, at least. There are things that need to be attacked, there are things that need to be challenged, there are wounds that need to be tied, and there are situations to walk away from because they are dangerous, and because there are moments where we need to take care of our basic safety on a physical level or our emotional and psychological level. But none of that should lead naturally by default to othering. There can always still be the other, but the othering is the part that is now the next step. And I do believe, I agree that we are born into it because we inherit those systems to a large degree. And as you said, we have to take intentional, conscious steps to then counteract that. There are ways to just accept that, okay, the way you do things is different from how we do things, but that does not have to lead to othering. Right? I don't need to have value judgments and diminishing kind of labels attached to that process of agreeing to disagree. And in all of this, I still have to distinguish between us judging establishments for abuses, us passing judgment on some positions that we cannot, in good conscience, agree with. And we have to also notice that these are not the things, you know, these are not the things that we are othering. What happens that goes wrong is when we attach a human being to it and we dismiss the human being with those things that we disagree with and cannot agree with. So I think that's how I see it. It's kind of like my children have currently, our house looks horrible because our children got a hold of a couple of balls of yarn that I had. And they are no longer balls, they are something quite horrific. And it was a good yarn, so I need to go and salvage that. But it will probably take me a lot of time to you know, to loosen that knot, that really tight intertwined knot, to loosen that knot and pull those threads up. And that's the metaphor that I use for a lot of our introspective work anyway, that a lot of the time stuff has got stuck together and glued together that shouldn't have got stuck together. Another metaphor that I use is like when you have scar tissue forming between your organs and you end up with lesions that are actually not enabling you to breathe properly or your organs to, you know, operate properly. Then you need surgical intervention there. You need to stretch it out to see where the wrong stuff is, and then to separate those two concepts, separate the human from the thing you don't agree with, separate the, you know, and separate the concept of the other from the practice of othering.
Okay, got it.
And I think that it's possible, but only with this kind of meticulous commitment to that work.
Thank you.
Yeah, I might be naive there. You can correct me. I'll correct myself down 50 years down the lane.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question, Barbara, and for the response. Brian, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kärt. That's been very, this is a topic that hits close to home in a number of ways. Myself, for example, I've been othered a lot because I have a handicap. My fingers are very affected. So it's something that I always, for me, when I see people being othered, it really bothers me. Somebody brought up a book that I think I would like to recommend everybody to. They brought it up in the chat. It was See No Stranger by Valerie Carr. And I don't know how many of you have read it. It's an excellent book. Valerie Carr is, she's Sikh. And this brings up an interesting other topic for me in terms of othering, because Muslims have been, othered quite thoroughly in our culture because they're viewed as terrorists, just as a group. And so we pick these certain sorts of traits that we think are characteristic of this other group, and then we put them on everybody in the group. And then there's collateral damage on top of that, because Sikhs, who have nothing to do with Muslims at all, are often targeted as the same, and seen as terrorists and dangerous people and so on. And so some of what she talks about in the book is that sort of thing. But I'm just thinking that the whole problem of collateral damage, because when we have these, we have signals that tell us what the others are, who the others are, and we take those and we lay them on everybody in the group. And I think you alluded to that in your talk a bit. And we've done another group that's happening to is immigrants. That they're just othered because there's immigrants include drug dealers and sex traffickers and all, and so that becomes who they are. And I guess one of the difficulties is, what do we do when with the othering of clearly bad people that are part of some of those groups, but maybe not distinctive of them, gets to become that group, that they as a group become those things that are all those negative, terrible things that, and it's out of fear. I mean, we're afraid, that these people are going to come in here and ruin our lives and ruin our country and perpetrate terrorism and so on. I guess how do we break through that? And by the way, Valerie Kärt talks about ways of doing that in her book, of trying to get out of that sort of mindset. But it does feel like a lot of our country is that way at this point. So,
yes,
so I don't know if you have any wisdom on that.
I wish I did. I'm sure that there are much wiser people who have not managed to get those wheels in motion. We are ultimately talking about, I want to kind of drag this discussion back to the place where I'm talking about. We're ultimately talking about the possibility of living and breathing freely, right? And we don't even realize to which degree those narratives that we project onto others are actually tying ourselves up. And I think maybe that is one of the parts that could be kind of like, there is a value to arguing cases, right? And there is good work being done in that category. And yet we also know that in all of the bias, the confirmation bias, the selection bias, in all of those biases, and we also know that human psychology is sadly not made, as the past years have wonderfully demonstrated, to be convinced by just arguments. There's a very small portion of humans who are convinced when somebody argues the case well. So I wonder if there's a layer of modeling, and modeling with a layer of explicit commentary, that could make a difference. Not in the scale of the entire US, I would imagine, but at least on the scale of around me. And to be intentional about that modeling, intentional about kind of emphasizing that as part of our values. There's another part of me that is really tempted to just throw us all out with the bathwater and hope that the next generations will be doing a little bit better if we equip like maniacs. But then again, if we model something different, then we can talk all we want, and they will still inherit the muscle memory of what we pass on to them. There was another, give me 1 second to gather my thoughts. I had something else. There was another thread that I wanted to pick up. Right, yes. The idea of a positive program. And I feel like the positive program, especially in our churches, oftentimes starts from going back to the basics. And yes, the idea of the gospel, but also our picture of God, our ultimate theology, the fact that on a theoretical level, we might not be afraid, but on a practical operational level, we are using tools and practices that are based on a theology of fear. And if we can go back to that basics, literally, like God just like start building this up from ground up, like what do we actually believe about you, and demonstrating how that builds into a community that is very different from what we are currently looking at. And in my head, when I think about that, it's almost like simultaneously drilling up and drilling down, and then seeing if you meet in the middle. And very often we realize that we don't meet in the middle. Like our professed values and theology is actually so different from what our practices and our culture demonstrates. And so often we don't even understand that that's the case. So
yeah, well, and I think from what you're saying too, this reminds me that when we do that kind of othering, that our country is doing so well right now in many ways, that we're actually hurting ourselves. Because
yes.
one of the things that reminds me is, for example, immigration. We've always needed immigration. It helps our country. We grow that way. We gain things. But when we other all the immigrants and want to leave them, say don't come in, we're hurting ourselves on so many levels. And you're right about the fear. We shouldn't be having the fear. God says don't fear, and yet we do operate out of fear. Yeah,
perfect love drives that out, right? And
yeah.
And there's a third practical layer to this, which is that we can be intentional about creating spaces where people meet people who are different. Like we don't have two separate birthday parties for our groups of friends, but we get them to the same table and we have a meal together, and that makes that evaporates kind of the disconnect layer, which then stops from the next things being so easy down that slope.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Brian, for that question. Linda, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you so much. Kärt, I wanted to, my comment actually, serendipitously, really kind of piggybacks on something you just spoke about, the tools of fear. And I want to suggest something that it might seem a bit odd, but it's almost the idea of reverse othering. And let me say what I mean by that. I think a lot of people know I co-teach an adult Sabbath school class. And this quarter we're studying Psalms. And I noticed, partly in the Teacher's Quarterly and partly in the regular quarterly, that there has been a fair amount of mention of the importance of us being in covenantal relationship with God, that God wants to be in a covenantal relationship with us. And I thought, well, that's odd. I mean, I wonder what's the difference between a covenantal relationship and just a regular relationship. And when I began to go through and sort of coagulate all the comments about this in the quarterly, here's the very short but progression of what this means. That being in a covenantal relationship with God, he demands righteousness living per the covenant. And that it's pointed out that we are neglectful of our covenantal relationship, and that God expects us to be faithful to our covenantal relationship. And then the pièce de résistance is that the basis of covenant is the law. And I thought, oh my God, here we are right back to the children of Israel again. All right, this is basically how their paradigm was set up. And then the discussion question that's in one of the very recent lessons says, as a church, we are called to do the same thing that ancient Israel was. And I guess I'm going to ask the question, why is it that we feel the need to gravitate back to all those things that were true for the children of Israel? I tell my class, if you think that's true, you should go back and read Deuteronomy 28 and see all the terrible things that are going to happen to people who don't live in the covenant. But I think I'm going to, in a sense, answer my question, but ask you to comment on it. And I think the reason why is because for us to give up the idea of othering in the way that you've described it today, we have to be willing to admit that many of our doctrines are not relevant or even biblical. And as an institution, I don't see how we would ever be willing to do that. So we're always creating other. It's he who has the best doctrine wins, and we think we do. And so on the one hand, we're gravitating. That's why, I mean, most of the people in my class still think you have to live by all those Levitical prohibitions. And they may say they believe in righteousness by faith, but when you look again at the drumbeat, your works have to be righteous. You have to conform to the commandments. The law is the basis. Why is it that we continue to go back there? And do you think there's any hope for us giving up the idea that all of our doctrines are the best there is in order to move away from othering?
I don't know if there's any hope. I keep asking myself on a weekly basis, because this is a question to the establishment, right? Which is why it's so hard. I do not know what the answer to that question is, and I don't think that anyone does. I mean, this is literally like I just shall go like this with the same layer of desperation. I just go like, oh Lord God, you know, like that's all I have to say in front of that valley of dryness, because I am thinking about it in those terms as well, and something that needs to come from all four winds to make an actual difference, right? And I don't, the only thing that I can do is that I can stand there as that one living being, and that is my responsibility, I think. And I'm not trying to deflect from answering, I just genuinely don't know. I also don't know how much power we have in any of that, how much we're going to turn into Don Quixote, you know, fighting the windmills ultimately. Yes, and whether that part of, I believe that some of us are called to do that, and I believe that some of us are distracted by it, and what we should actually be doing is just speaking life over those bones and be satisfied with actually, it's almost like be satisfied with doing God's work, not necessarily without the church, but regardless of the church, right? Like it doesn't have to be against the church, it doesn't have to be of the church, it's just regardless of the church. And as somebody mentioned earlier that our circles are so, Lauren, I think you mentioned that you don't have enough friends in our communities. One of my good friends actually said that to me some years ago, and it took me 2 years to actually make it land. But our communities and our community, our communal structures, the things that are truly our church, oftentimes end up mapping on the structural church like this, and that this should be okay. Like, this is the church, the SDA establishment, and this is my people with whom I live God and my story of God. And that's okay. And I can treat this part here as a mission field, and I can treat this part here as a mission field, and I can just, it's my duty just to speak that life over those bones. And ultimately, I need to be predominantly worried about that. Because what God does with the Adventist Church is ultimately God's business, and we don't have the power to save it or to take it to hell with us.
Well, and I certainly I agree, but I think at least for some of us, you know, based on how I read the chat every week, is that we have become less comfortable identifying ourselves as Seventh-day Adventist Christians because the very mention automatically creates a divide, automatically puts up a barrier. You know, most of my friends are non-Adventists. And I'm really not sympathetic to Lauren particularly, because if he wants to understand othering in the church, he should be a mid-30-year-old woman, a professional who's recently divorced, and then he's going to find out what othering is like. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Linda. I have been in that position that you just described. I can tell you that is definitely a different place to be. Before I bring Robert in, I did have a comment because I recently had the pleasure of staying in the home of a Hindu family. And while I was there, it wasn't that I was in the home of a Hindu family. I was staying with friends. You know, that's really what it felt like. And I was reminded of a presentation that Raj did maybe a year or so ago, where he spoke about all of the things that we can learn from others who worship differently. And as you mentioned, you know, the mission field just now, I wonder, do we have to view those who are different as mission fields as opposed to just embracing the similarities and learning, you know, from them the things that they may actually do better than we do?
Yeah. I think I just stepped onto a mine there, because for me, the word mission is a really complicated one as well. I am not talking about proselytizing. I am not talking about getting them into our ranks. I am talking about God's mission as the act of breathing life and providing freedom. So that is the only qualifying category in that, being within our spirit gifted sphere of influence, with the gifts that we have, with the space that we have, with the roots that we have, with the languages that we speak, you know, and I don't mean just literal languages, but the spaces in which we are meaningful and the spaces that are meaningful to us, to speak life, right? That's literally what mission is for me. It has nothing to do with memberships or ranks or anything of that type. And the truth is that some of those dry bones that we look at might be from both the dry bones and the living creatures come from all sorts of backgrounds, is my experience as well. So so just to identify the dry bones and speak life. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I like that. The dry
Yeah,
bones
sorry,
and the
I
living
shouldn't have.
creatures.
I'm actually usually quite cautious of using that word. And when anyone else does, of course, I project all sorts of stuff into it and I get a twitchy eye. So so yeah, sorry, I
No.
stepped in.
That's all right. Robert, please join the conversation.
Yes, I don't have a question, but I have some comments. Referring to what Lauren said, I would say that except for family and three best friends, most of my acquaintances and friends are in the what many would call the outside world. And I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful that I never went to an Adventist school. My older brother was sent to one, and the reports he came back with were quite frightening. I'm sure the other students would have made mincemeat of me. Also, as a church musician, I have played, of course, in the Adventist church until I was booted off the bench, and also for many other denominations. And I find that I always feel very comfortable in the other denominations. Just walking into an Adventist church, I've sort of got my back up. I'm sure they're going to find something wrong with me. Just as one example, I used to attend a very large church, and to keep myself awake, which is really no comment on the sermon, I would take notes. So my head would be bent down like this. And every week, somebody would come up to me and say, "What's wrong with your neck?" And to me, this is just an attitude of being a critic. For some reason, I find that so many Adventists think they're so wonderful, and they want to point out any deficiency in other people. Now, after saying all that, I guess I have to admit that I have made Adventists into the other. I know they're not all critical. I know they are not always watching to see how they can put other people down. So anyways, that's my comment. I certainly did enjoy your presentation.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to pick one of those things that you commented on, which is that we feel that we feel in other contexts, we feel somehow more welcome and more free. And this might be because those other contexts are more welcoming. This might also be because we don't speak the language well enough to understand how they are not. And we don't have all of those layers of meaning, like the air is not as thick with meaning as it would be in a space that is ours, where we understand all of those nuances. We don't have the pressure to perform because we are the other. And I think that that is the category. It's sometimes wonderful to be the other because you get away with stuff. right? We had a wedding to plan with Tihi. He's Serbian and I'm an Estonian, and well, our families were wonderful anyway, so they would have been fine with anything. But also you have these extended families, and then you have the pressures of what a proper wedding looks like and what has to happen and what shouldn't happen. The fact that we were on that cross section, you know, like the third country or third culture thing that we could create for ourselves. It was wonderful because we could literally just go like, whoopsie, you know, like we have to negotiate stuff between two cultures. We invented stuff. And you can do that when you're on that boundary, but you can't do that when you're in that center. And when you are a completely almost like irrelevant other, then you can do things and people will just go like, oh, well, you know, curious cultures, curious creatures, and it is not held against you. It is the exotic thing, right? Whereas if you are one of our own, you should know better. You know exactly what you're doing. You are introducing layers of meaning in here that you should have no business introducing. You are crossing the boundaries intentionally, and all of that added layer of that thickness of significance avalanches down on you, and you have no way of kind of like wrestling free from it. So I think that's an interesting category to consider. I see it often at work with worship music, because we get irritated by the others that we know, but the ones that are completely unknown to us, there's no friction against our fields of meaning. And then they're like, oh, interesting, you know, but we don't have the same layers of kind of like, how dare you? The stuff that we go, how dare you, has to be close enough to home to provide friction. So that's another kind of layer to that category of other, which you just triggered. Sorry, I just went off. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your comment. Emmanuel, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you very much. Your presentation touched me deeply, penetrate under my skin and penetrate my DNA, because I am in the middle of something right now that I'm going to share with you. And the question I have for you, how we translate your presentation every week in the pew. Why I ask you the question? Because we saw something in the 1950s with Dr. Walter Martin, and we have the book Question and Doctrine, and this created a storm. For the last 2 weeks, I am back and forth with a friend of mine, college graduate. I am telling him we have a problem saying Constantine changed the Sabbath into Sunday on March 321. And we have a tremendous amount of historical data that prove otherwise. The name he didn't call me is because he forgot, but he gave me all the name in the book. So othering, we don't have to leave the church. We experience othering inside the church. How can you disagree with me and I see you as a brother or a sister in Christ without putting a sticker on your forehead? And it seems to me that othering is part of the DNA of Seventh-day Adventism. Can we change our DNA?
Mm-hmm. Can leopard change his spots? Yeah, I think that you're pointing out a wonderful thing, and it links back to one of the first things that Lauren actually said, that as a pastor, you are othered in your own community, and we are very good at doing it within our own community. We are wonderful. We are truly a proper family, like no uncle, no auntie, no like nephew. We just bicker and we bicker and we bicker, and it's that we do well to call each other brethren, because that's literally what we do. It's just we pull each other's ears and we twist each other's noses, and then we're happy that we're a family. I don't know, again, the question whether this can be changed on a grander scale than just me and my sphere of influence, I don't know. I know that I myself am, I would map on that continuum of more progressive, more traditional, or revisionist. I would definitely map onto more progressive. And it has been one of my personal struggles to make sense of how to operate with a community that might not see the things the same way. And for me, what happens is that I operate with conceptual frameworks, and if I make sense of something, I make sense of that something, right? And now somebody else comes in and goes like, this doesn't make sense, or this doesn't make sense for me, or this cannot make sense, or your sense making must be of the devil. And then I just have to kind of, as I look at that person and as I intentionally try to resist the tendency in me that would be so sweet to start actively othering, then what I do is that I zoom out in the picture and I conceptualize a world in which God is generous enough to reach out for me where I am at, and is generous enough and loving enough to reach out for that other person wherever they are at. And again, it doesn't have to lead to a clash, because ultimately, no matter how much we want to bang that pot, doctrine does not matter. Our relationship with God matters on our walk with God. Now, doctrine matters insofar as we are trying to find ways how to make more and more sense of God, and to determine what kind of a God we are serving and having the relationship with. Now, but having a misguided understanding as part of our journey is inevitable. So in that sense, if I put that kind of the doctrinal compulsion as the one determining thing of our relationship to the side, then I can actually create a conceptual framework where that brother or that sister, wherever they may be, that theoretically clashes with my conceptualization of God, can still be walking a walk with God, right? And as I then also discern, because I'm trying hard to exercise those muscles of discernment of the Spirit, I can recognize the voice of the Spirit in that person working, and I can recognize the voices that are coming from other places. And as I recognize the work of the Spirit in that person, I can also leave the Spirit some space to do that work, instead of just pushing them out with a brush and then assuming that that somehow purified my camp. I don't know if that makes sense, but if we had that mentality in our churches, that each of us are walking our walk with God, no matter exactly where we are, no matter what fabric we are made of, no matter what our gifting and our meaningful spaces and how they are different, that God is reaching out and doing that work, then the picture comes big enough to actually accommodate that person. It gets complicated when we are talking about operational decisions and actual practical clashes in the board, so to say, about what to do. But I naively believe that even then, if we build up a community from that base layer that actually then enables people to see that bigger picture, then we should be able to come together and still appreciate God working in somebody else's story meaningfully, and then working in my story meaningfully, even though those stories are so different.
Let me add something. When we listen to the president of General Conference lately, you don't like it, leave. How do you think that it will be possible that this, what you described this afternoon, could ever become a reality in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? To be honest with you, I will say no, but you know maybe better than me. How do you see that becoming a reality in the church?
It might not become the reality of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because as I say, it's an establishment and it's a tricky one to, it's a, now I'm going to evoke all sorts of thick layers of significance, but I didn't mean it like that. But then it's a beast of a kind, right? And now this like full revelation and Daniel comes down. I just meant that it's a certain type of a beast, and it's a mighty one. So I don't know anything about that, but I do believe that it is possible in an Adventist church, and in very many ways. I also have the luxury of talking about this not from the United States, so it's not exactly at my doorstep. I am more at a distance, so maybe I'm speaking out of privilege of not minding that much. But that's what I can experience. Like, come to Europe. Let's see.
All right. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, for your comments and questions. Ed, both Eds are back to back. Ed Zerkwich, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Hi, I was very pleased to listen to your presentation and bring up othering, or bothering, I guess, in some cases. So I want to start off by reading what ChatGPT has to say about othering. Othering is a concept used to describe the process of conceiving or treating someone or a group of people as fundamentally different or alien from oneself or one's own group. It often involves emphasizing differences in order to create a sense of us versus them, or to justify unequal treatment or discrimination. Now, before I get to my question, I want to relay a little bit of a story. About 35 years ago, currently my wife and I live on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada, but we lived in Saskatoon in the prairies. And they had a Billy Graham crusade come to our city of about 250,000 people, and about 125 churches were involved in supporting that crusade or evangelistic meetings. And after the meetings, anybody who came forward during the meetings would fill out this card, just like the Adventist Church does in their evangelism, in a sense. And we would gather representatives of different churches, and if someone wrote down Catholic, if they had some former or present affiliation with Catholic or Presbyterian, or whatever it was, then whoever represented that church would put their hand up and they would get this lead, you see, with the idea of following up with that person. So the crusade wasn't to be pointing people in a certain direction, but rather it was sort of a joint effort, and that's how it worked. Now, I don't remember ever seeing someone say they were Seventh-day Adventist or affiliated with it. But at any rate, one of the interesting things I found was we would mingle, we'd have to wait to get these cards, and we would mingle and discuss that, oh, you're Seventh-day Adventist. Oh, what is that church like? Or you're Presbyterian. And I remember saying, oh, yeah, to someone in a certain church, and I forget what it was. I said, oh, yeah, you're similar to so-and-so. They said, oh, no, we were very different. And it was some minor little thing, I thought, but they strongly identified that they were not part of that particular church, Christian church. Whereas I think most people would see them similar. So, but that was just, I wouldn't say that was othering. It was just people being curious. That was my perception of it. People being curious, people seeing diversity, differences, and so forth. Although I noticed when someone said, the person who said, oh, no, we're not that so-and-so, there was a strong emotion. They showed a bit of anger, and which surprised me. But going back to this definition, and it closes just to remind you, us versus them, or to justify unequal treatment or discrimination. So if you go by that definition, how do we know when we are seeing or perceiving other people or groups as different, that is leading up to us versus them, or discrimination, or unequal treatment? Discernment maybe is another word there.
Yes. And I think discernment is precisely that, because there was also that layer of the that where the definition kind of got into it's you identify somebody else as different from you, and then you emphasize those differences so that you would be able to create your own identity in reaction against them. And then comes the key word, it is us versus them, right? And I think that that's the place where that slope starts kind of going. Whereas it's been inevitable, and now we've smoothly just like gone over the edge. And that's why it's so dangerous, because it is so natural to take those steps. Because once the other is out there, it's so easy to do all of those things. It's so easy to, there's somebody else earlier who was mentioning this, and it crossed my mind, the idea of kind of, they lose the privilege of being seen as single cases, of being seen as individuals. They are suddenly all just this blur of a monolith group, and they all do this, and if you are a member of that group, you all do that. And I think that, and then you end up with this, then you can't even challenge that anymore, because when you have that established pattern of this, then you deploy the no true Scotsman fallacy. I don't know if you've ever heard of this one, right? Which ultimately just means that, okay, so I often experience that as a woman. That's the category where it's showed up the most, and as an Eastern European, because those are my labels that get dismissed the quickest. So one of them has been precisely like, yeah, no, but you're not like a you're not like a real woman. I'm like, excuse me. That was related to me doing sermons. It's like, people can't preach, women can't preach, they just don't know how to, it's just not in them. I'm like, have you heard me preach? I'm so sorry that I've been so lousy at it. It's like, no, but you're not like a woman. I'm like, last I checked, I was, but I get dismissed because I am I get dismissed as statistically irrelevant data. I am not a part of that category because I am not confirming to those categories anymore. And it's a magical thing that then just happens, that people, the brain gymnastics that you ultimately have to deploy to then go against the data that you have, you intentionally almost have to ignore that. And that yet it's in our nature to do that so consistently. I think that's the place where it goes wrong. I hope that I just ended up actually answering your question or commenting on your comment, because I've gone off now. Was there anything else, Ed, that you wanted to add? Or did I forget to pick up anything?
Sorry, I was muted again. I was just going to add to the, like, your illustration, obviously, but over my many years in the Adventist churches, there's a whole slew of othering, you know, at all kinds of levels within the church. You gave one very good example, you know, this discrimination against women doing certain roles or preaching or being ordained pastors and so on and so on. You know, I mean, that's a pretty predominant one, but there's all kinds of othering and within the Adventist church. And of course, on this site here or venue, we always hear examples each week, it seems. And we don't have to go outside the church. You know, we need to identify and clear up all the stuff that's going within the church. But certainly it goes on, you know, between denominations of all kinds and so forth. And politics too gets into it.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much, Ed. And from one Ed to the other, Ed Reifsnyder, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Well, it appears I don't live in outer space like the last Ed. Intriguing picture there. It struck me that we have done it again in our conversation here this afternoon, and largely been internally focused. We have spent a lot of our talk time talking about otherism within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it's very typical of us, of Adventists, is to gaze at our navels all the time. And I'm wondering why we do that when there's a whole big world out there of possibility for otherings. Whether it's racial, whether it's cultural, whether it's national, whether it's political, whether it's economic. We want to stay inside and talk about ourselves and how we do othering within the church. Maybe that's part of our problem. And I don't have any place I'm going with this in particular. It was mostly an observation on our conversation that we have done it again. We stayed pretty much internal to our little culture. And I wish we wouldn't do that. Maybe that's why we, like anybody else, have challenges with othering those who are outside of our little circle, because we want to focus in our circle. Somehow I feel like we need to break free. Can you help us break free, Kärt?
I think only God can do that. It's like, but I really appreciate what you've just said. And I feel like this is, we focus on the place that hurts, the place of this injury, you know. And this is where we've all been injured. This is where the scar tissue is. This is where the lesions are. This is where the knot is. And this is ultimately, like, this is the wish that I wish we could breathe free. You know, even in our stories, as some of us might be called to speak harsh truths into those abuses and those histories, right? But even in those, I wish that we could do it as free breathing individuals, free breathing communities, because the moment that we get so stuck in that knot, this ties us down. It's almost like it curves our spine, literally, so that you can't even look up anymore, because all you see are those toes, you know. And I wish that we were a body that could, you know, walk and run with God and do that with freedom and joy and speak into those spaces that have hurt us, if this is our calling. But ultimately, like, we don't want to be tied by that thing. We don't want to be tied inside of that thing. We don't want to be tied, you know, to that hurt that the church has caused us. We don't, you know, all of those traumas are not what defines us. So ultimately, it's a question of going back to those categories that we have created and asking, what does my theory consider the key identification categories that I use for myself, individually and communally, and also what my practice is and my focus and the things that the fruit that I bear then drills back, kind of, and do those things meet. And I think in that sense, you're literally you're speaking, you're doing diagnostics as we live and breathe. You've just done diagnostics on us. And it would be nice if we had a different result there.
All right. Thank you so much, Ed, for that observation. Gerald, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you. And I appreciate the timing. Ed Reifsnyder, I think that you speak truth, because we have to get back to something that we can really do that's positive. And David Barrett prompted me to do some thinking here this afternoon, and I come to realize that I think one of the things that I find the most joyful in my continued service, and I that's part of my life, is that I serve with other people to defeat common enemies. Now, yesterday afternoon, that was as simple as trying to make a slight modification in an antique race car and not botch up the thing. The guy wanted some extra eyes, and it's kind of ironic because Paul only has one eye. But the other guys in the shop helped him a lot. We put a new speedometer cable in for him in his ancient Lotus race car. But we were working on a project together. In the last year, I've joined a band, an American Legion band, and we're in it together. We won the national championship last year. We're going to do it again this year in New Orleans. And 2 weeks ago, when my little church orchestra needed an oboist, I let it be known in the band, and I had lots of responses for people suggesting a solution. And they asked it, how did it work out? They cared. I serve in a volunteer community clinic for people who can't insure themselves. And we work together to help these people. I also commit my continued life in medicine, truncated by no longer being in private practice, to working with hospice patients. Now, if you want a final common pathway about whom we all can care, it's those who are dying.
Mm.
I'm dying, you are dying, we all are dying, and we can all find this commonality. And when I serve with my Roman Catholic priest, chaplain, and with Buddhists who are on the volunteer board, and interact with people who are atheists, foxhole Christians, you name it, there's a commonality there. And I'm serving together. They're not others. We're all part of this.
Mm.
And David Barrett is right when he says that we all need to find something to care about rather than something to argue about. And I think finding our way in service is very Christian if I read the Gospels with any degree of certainty at all.
Amen.
All right. Thank you so much, Gerald. It is now the time that we unofficially wrap up. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren to make some announcements about what's coming next. And then we will continue to kind of have the conversation in the foyer. Lauren?
Yeah, I just want to let you know, I usually about this time, around 3:30, I let you know what's coming up. And next week, we have one of our favorite teachers back. He hasn't been able to teach for us for a while, but that is Denis Fortin, who was the dean of the seminary at Andrews University for a number of years and is now a professor of historical theology there. And I don't know if you've noticed that over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been a series of books coming out about notable Adventist figures in our history. The first one I read was Gerald Wheeler's book about James White, and I highly recommend it. I think it's a fantastic book. You really need to read it if you haven't. Well, Dr. Fortin has written one that's coming out soon, and I believe this is what he's going to be talking about. It's going to be about George Ide Butler, G.I. Butler. I just wondered why they always identified themselves by their two first initials back then. It's always G.I. Butler. Anyway, he's going to be writing about Butler. Interesting character. He's the guy who raised the money for Battle Creek College, which became Andrews University. He's the one who took on Canwright. And so it should be pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to it. So mark that down. As I mentioned before, if you have the chance to share with others this class, we are at this point probably the largest online class that keeps going and going and going in the Adventist Church. There are others that have really some really good classes out there. I won't tell you what they are because I don't want to lose you here, but I think most of them meet earlier anyway. But next week is going to be Dr. Fortin, and I would look forward to having you there. I will turn it over let me mention one more thing, Cherry Ann, before we go back to Bill and Debbie. Something I've been trying to think about, and I would appreciate your reaction to this. Something we haven't really done much of here, just only informally now and then, is to do any kind of spiritual work with one another. And lately I've been thinking maybe something that we could do with Adventist Today Sabbath seminars is have maybe a time at the end when we have a break-off group who want to talk about with one another, talk about things that they want others to pray for. I don't want it to become that, but I want it to be available. So I'm just going to mention this to you and let you know that it's something we're thinking about and trying to find a way of doing. Zoom has this ability for people to break off into another group, and maybe there'd be another group who could meet. It isn't for everybody, but maybe there'd be the ability for us to meet and have somebody pray for those who have. We don't have a lot of time for that necessarily, but we should take some time for it for those for whom that is a need. So it's not going to take over our main group or our main class, but I want you to be thinking about that. We haven't quite figured out quite how to do it yet, but we will. That's all. And let's finish up with Bill and Debbie, Doug and Teresa, and Dr. Liebert, and anybody else who wants to join in. When we have no more hands, we'll bring it to a close. Thank you. Been a wonderful class. Thank you, Kärt, and thank you, Cherry Ann, for being a good moderator.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Bill, Debbie, please go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to bring up, I am currently in the process of reading the book called Kärt. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it really is a comparison of caste system in India with Nazi Germany and with the US. And what the premise is that I have gathered so far is that it's basically othering, as we're talking about here, but it's a hierarchy. And when you have, what the real issue is when a group of people feel they're superior to every other group. And then you have a whole hierarchy of who's on that ladder. And I think that's similar to what we're talking about here, is when one group of people feel they're superior to others, then that othering becomes toxic. Yes. So if I, as a white American, feel I'm better to everybody else in the world, that's going to be toxic. If I, as an Adventist, believe that I'm better religiously or spiritually to other people in the world, other religions, that's going to be toxic. And I think that's what we've kind of danced around here, but I thought there was an interesting perspective and seems to be really, I think, pretty accurate. And I would just kind of like your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that's literally what this is ultimately. You were mentioning this idea of the caste, and there's a layer of kind of class system here in the UK that I still keep being baffled about how that's there. And then in those well-established patterns of othering, then you end up with actually internalized sense of inferiority and all of those layers. And if we do for a moment open our eyes back to the Adventist church and the community, then we also do that, let's say, in a hierarchy of gifting. We have a hierarchy of gifts, and we have strong narratives related to that. There are those who are the gifts of teaching and preaching are the ultimate gifts. The public gifts are elevated over and above the gifts of certain types of service, or what we don't talk about at all are the kind of the more practical, the more material gifts, like the gift of finances or the gift of business, or it gets too dangerous, because then we are kind of like attaching gifts to the concept of mammon and all of those categories. So there's we still have that type of a system in our structures. If you yeah, and it's difficult, because then the question is, are those systems mobile? Are they not? I know that standardly in the US, a lot of that system is related to one's financial situation, and so it is socioeconomic status, whereas in England it is predominantly inherited status. So your bloodline, you have systems where this is just something that you can't move in at all. So that's another kind of question. It would be interesting to actually look at our communities and then try and map all these different layers in the predictable categories and also the unpredictable categories. Where do we hit those things? Where do we make those hierarchies? And where does it get toxic? Because there's plenty of that going around. I also wanted to highlight the idea that that I am trying to constantly remind myself that we are talking about the seen world, and then we are also talking about the realm that we are not able to access with our eyes and everything else. And we are talking about ultimately the conflict, the great conflict, which I do believe in. And it is wonderful if you start discerning and identifying those voices, where they come from. Then those voices, being able to identify those voices from the two sides, from the side of the light and from the side of the darkness, is also an avenue to actually, to a degree, separate that individual from the things that somebody's saying, from the abuses that they are perpetuating, etc., etc. So being able to identify the moments when your significant other, for example, or your brother or your sister says something that is downright mean, it is their choice to let that voice speak through them. But it is also something that they don't ultimately, this is not who they are, And I think that the people close to us that we love, we have the power to kind of see beyond what they might do. And the further people get, the more we, like, the smaller that chance is that we see beyond. And I think that if we approach if you approach the world around us from that angle, that I think is a gift, this idea that to understand that there are sides, that there are agencies that are, there are powers that are interested in one side and in the other side, and then seeing each person and each community as a battlefield for those powers, it actually gives us a possibility to see beyond, even more than anyone who would consider the spiritual world nonsense or non-existent. So as people who believe in the spiritual, we are uniquely equipped to see beyond and not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, to be able to actually dig deeper and, go like, I can't identify with that voice, but dude, whatever you're struggling with, I'm here for you.
All right. Thank you so much, Debbie, for your question and for that response, Kärt. Doug, please go ahead and join the conversation.
What a wonderful presentation. And I thought Ed and Jerry addressed some very salient points. I grew up in a medical family, and I became aware early on that there was othering within the medical profession. There were the doctors, and then there were the nurses and the technicians, and there was a hierarchy there. And it's gotten a little bit better over time as a viewer from the outside. But I was disappointed as a youngster, always interested in aviation and ultimately going into that, to see that same thing existed within the aviation community. There were pilots, and then there were the others. And there were even types of pilots, tail dragger pilots and jet pilots and airline pilots and glider pilots. And it always was a bit disappointing to me because I thought all of those were really interesting and I wanted to do them all. And everybody thought I was crazy. A few years ago, while I was in the airline industry, I had a wonderful boss who was very military in his background and in his orientation to life. Bless his heart, he was one of the people in our management structure that was very proactive in introducing something that some may be familiar with, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI. And the reason MBTI was formed, apparently, was exactly the reasons we're talking about. Myers and Briggs got together and tried to figure out how they could emphasize the differences while emphasizing the positive parts of those differences. And we spent a lot of time in that company that I worked for figuring out who we were. And I found out I was about a 5% of the adult population by being an INTJ, for those of you that are familiar with that. And I was different than all of the other people in management in that respect. And to his credit, that so helped my boss understand how I was different. And it helped me to understand how I was different and how that fit nicely within the organizational structure. And the point of all of that was, I believe, to help us serve each other better. And after 25 or 30 years in the airline business, I left that after 7 airlines and strangely enough went into banking, which I had no background in. And the people that interviewed me kept saying how positive it was that I was being interviewed for the position I was. And I kept thinking, they're crazy because I have no background. They had figured out that my talent fit very well in a field that was completely different in some respects. And so I think the thing that over the years I started to realize, feeling like an outsider most of my life, is that that uniqueness is there for service. And I need to find what it is. I'll give you another crazy illustration. My wife and I lived in a little place not far from where we live now. We were going to change the landscaping and we were on the cheap. So at the end of the growing season, we went to one of the local places, landscape places, and we bought what we could of these plants, these little trees. And one of them was, it looked like Charlie Brown's Christmas tree. It was ugly. It was ugly because the main part of it was like every other one, but then it had this big one that grew off the side and it was like, ooh, that is really ugly, but it was cheap, so we bought it. Well, we wound up using most of them, and the particular place where we were trying to cover up was a bunch of utility boxes that were ugly, and we were going to cover them up with these trees. It turned out that that one tree fit nicely where it covered up the top of a utility box by the branch that came out that looked so ugly. It broke my heart because I found that tree's place in our lives. And I think that as Adventists, as Christians, as whatever it is in life, if we can find that special place that God has for us, that is the whole point of diversity, of being different, and celebrating that is to find the place that God has for us to be in service. And pointing out all the other flaws of all the other people is to avoid seeing that special place that God has for us in his amazing, diverse universe. Anyway, some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Doug. Thank you so much. Ron, please join the conversation.
Thank you, Sherry. Professor Lazić. Lazić, I
I'm
think.
far
Is it
from being a
Lazić?
professor, but thank you, Lazić.
Lazić. Well, you have been Professor Uriel today. It is a very fine presentation, and my hand went up in contradiction to one person. I'll say who. I think that what we read in the New Testament about Jesus has to do with Jesus speaking to the community to which he belongs and talking to them and not outside. So when we have a fault within our community, as you did today, I think that's what you were doing. You were not othering, but rather helping us to see that it's inside the church we need to make criticisms when we need to change, and not outside. So my hand went up when I thought what Ed was saying was to contradict what you were saying. That is, you need to go outside.
Ooh.
That's my comment.
No, and you're in that sense, it makes perfect sense as well. We can only properly critique what we know. So if we are going into down the kind of critical analytical route, then we'd better know what we are critiquing. But then it's also true that if we are looking inside, then we are more likely to critique, because this is the place where that's our function. And I think I really appreciate Ed's point that we do also need to look outside and see how we can actually be significant as those liberators, as those people who bring peace and joy and cut the ties and, do the full service that Jesus has called us to do in places that are not in our garden, but also outside of our garden, so to say. So I think I think your thoughts are married anyway.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Liebert. And Sherry, you will have the final question today.
Why, thank you. I felt bad I missed some of the discussion because our internet has been really funky this afternoon. But this has been an awesome presentation and discussion. And it's taken me some time to work through it, but I realize that I have felt totally othered throughout my adult life in the Adventist church because of being a feminist. And it comes back to me an experience I had many years ago in the Collegedale area. A social worker I supervised looked at me one day and she said, "Sherry, I just can't believe it. I've known lots of Adventists, but you're the first Adventist I've ever known who said she was a feminist," and I don't know if I should say this, "and who also swore." But so I looked at her, and back then I really felt like I was Adventist. And I just said, well, there's a lot of Adventists that are very different. And I feel very differently now about the church, but now it's been a realization that really inside the church, I felt othered because of how I believed women should be treated. That's all. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was awesome.
Thank you so much thank you. And thank you for bringing up feminism, because that was one of those categories that I was thinking, should I bring this up or should I not bring this up? Because that's actually a parallel to my story in Adventism at the moment. We talk a lot, and even in our comments section, we talk a lot about what the church should be and could be and all of those things that it is doing wrong. And we are not wrong about those things. Those points of critique are entirely valid. What I have with Adventism is similar to what I have with feminism, because feminism is such a broad category, and I go around and I intentionally tell people that I am a feminist. And by the way, so are you. if you are, I had to tell my dad that. He's like, "What do you mean?" "Well, you raised me with these principles, so you are." But he's like, "But I haven't been burning bras anywhere." I'm like, well, that's only a tiny section. And that's only one element of what happened in the history, and it happened for very good reasons. And now when you look at it after all these 3 waves and everything, it is a broad world, and those people don't fully see eye to eye, and I am still a part of them. I'm not going to let go of that label, because I want you to know that you are one too. Because the moment that you don't know that you are one too, and the moment that you don't believe that I am one, it's so easy to other them. And I feel like the same is kind of related to my being an Adventist. Like, there are so many things that are done that I don't do, but I am sticking to the label because I'm like, I am an Adventist too, and you don't get to tell me to walk out, because you don't get to define what this is. I am an Adventist and I am here, and you can tell me no, true Scotsman, but like, I'm not leaving this place till God tells me to go, because this is my ground and I'm just standing and I'm making my point. Deal with it. Like, deal with the fact that I'm an Adventist. And I believe that that in itself is like, at this stage of my life, I almost feel like if I stepped out, I would have given them the right to hijack it. And I'm like, this is too precious a concept for me to let go of, so that you can just hijack it. So that's why I keep talking about the bubble and kind of like making it my own, as I'm making feminism my own, I'm making Adventism my own. That's gonna be that's the last line.
Thank you, Kärt, and I think that's such a beautiful note on which to end.